This is the BBC.
Dear brothers and sisters, all are welcome here at the Confessions podcast, whether saint or sinner.
Well, hey and hello and welcome to another Confessions podcast from the BBC. We're trying to work this out. Is this the penultimate one?
Is it really? Wow.
Don't know, just thinking about that. There's one next week anyway. Let's not make any crazy rash promises. Who knows what the future holds? Who knows?
Fancy dress next week.
That's
yes.
That's an interesting
Yes.
one.
We've talked about it. We need to do one. Yes.
Anyway, here we go with another Confessions podcast, and Joe and Bobby are here as ever.
Yes, this week's confession collection includes Raphael's story, Finders Weepers. We have Emily's Tale, Threads Are Burning. We have Wendy's Revenge, Dirty Dripping Hood, and a classic confession from the crypt featuring an international footballer and the beautiful South. Unlikely, I know.
Yes, yeah, that's true. I do like that confession, though. It's very good and much loved. First, we start with Once Bitten, Twice Pie.
Please be seated.
Father Simon and the BBC Collective, this one says. The scene is set some 30 years ago when our design agency was in its infancy. We had anguished calls from one of our most important clients who was trying to solve a problem preparing products for a blind taste. Okay, it's a blind taste testing in a large, very important and very, very expensive piece of market research. Can I just emphasize how expensive this piece of market research was? The products in question, and you might nod knowingly at this point, were tinned steak and kidney pies. The flat, shallow type where you removed the lid with a can opener and popped in a hot oven to bake for a short period. I used to love those. They were the greatest things. If you're a vegetarian, you can't join in this bit.
No, but this was young. I was young. It's great.
Okay, the problem was that nobody had come up with a suitable way of concealing the branding of the various products. It was imperative that anyone taking part in the blind testing was unaware of which brand they were tasting, since this would skew the results. Apparently all sorts of methods have been tried, and the best solution to date had been to spray paint all the tins white. This had several downsides, however. Paint sometimes flaked off during opening, and so many coats of paint were required to cover the branding completely, and that was impractical to paint 200 tins required for the research. Could our agency come to the rescue? Of course we could. I must confess, having taken the job on, I struggled for days to come up with a better solution. But then I remembered that many years back, I had used the services of a shot blasting company to remove some rust from the bumpers of my rotting Cortina. Genius. If this worked, it would solve both the flaking problem and the brand obscuring problem, and maybe it could be done reasonably efficiently, and I would make a few bob and be a hero into the bargain. What could possibly go wrong? I rang Graham, who owned the shot blasting company, and he suggested I bring in a tin just to see what he could do. So I arrived, he took the tin, placed it in a cage, donned a helmet, and let loose with the gun. I recall there was lots of noise and dust as he fired the pellets at the tin, opened the cage, inverted the tin again, and let loose once more. Moments later, he opened the cage and presented the fruits of his labour. Wow, what a result. It was perfect. Nothing to be read, everything gone. I explained my plan to my client, and he seemed relieved to have found a solution. The 200 tins were boxed up neatly in 12 large boxes according to the brand. I took them to the shot blasters, where I met with Graham. I explained the time constraints, that the deadline wasn't movable, and I reiterated the importance of keeping the 12 sets of tins in the correct boxes. Graham wrote reassuring notes and took it all in. I followed up a couple of times during the week just to ensure that everything was going according to plan, and was reassured each time. Obviously, this was a very, very expensive piece of research. Nothing could go wrong. Then finally the phone rang to say that all 200 plus tins were complete. Excellent. As I arrived to pick up the pies, a fairly scruffy-looking individual was there to meet me. "Where's Graham?" I asked. "Oh, yeah," he said.
It's Ray!
He said, Graham's he's been off. He's sick. How long for? He's been off since Wednesday. Oh, okay, no problem. Where are my boxes? What boxes? My boxes of tins? Oh, yeah, those. They're here. We put them all in one big box because we thought that would be easier to put in the van. Can I have a look? Sure enough, to my absolute horror, there were my 200 tins, all perfectly debranded, all perfectly identical, and all perfectly piled up in one heap in the corner of the room. Do you know which brand is which? I asked. The expression on his face meant that I didn't require an answer. It was obvious. I drove the tins back to the office in a cold sweat. I spent the next 5 hours trying to distinguish the different tins by reading the tiny letters and numbers stamped into the lids and attempted to group different brands together. It was utterly hopeless. I had no option but to collect the tins, place them randomly into a dozen boxes, each bearing a fictitious label with a brand written on it, and present them to my client. Apparently the research went ahead over the next week, and no doubt the questionnaires from the recipients were pored over for ages and ages and at great expense by the agency folk. When I later inquired how the research had gone, I was informed that having spent tens of thousands of pounds, that's tens of thousands of pounds, the research results were, and I quote, disappointingly inconclusive. A phrase that rings down through my years. So says Mike, I seek forgiveness not from the agency, who wasted a great deal of time and money, or from the pie developers, who may well have been given a bum steer, but I do seek forgiveness from my long-suffering wife, who I kept awake far too often, tossing and turning and breaking out in cold sweats for many, many weeks afterwards, because, it wasn't really Mike's fault. It was probably Graham's friend, who just piled them all into one space. Let's see what Joe makes of that.
I've written cold sweat in capital letters here and underlined it a few times because I nearly broke into a cold sweat listening to that story. Oh my gosh, what do I think about this? I think, no, I'm not entirely sure myself either. No, I think it was unfortunate, so I'm going to forgive. It was one of those things where you were trying to cut corners and just it all went horribly wrong. And I think he's probably suffered enough as a result, so I'm going to forgive. Bobby,
yes. First of all, why I'm not going to forgive, and then just an add-on, just a note. Because you only tested one pie can. They were different brands. Those pie tins might have been made of different materials. So in the very first instance, you're not forgiven because you weren't testing both of the containers. Because one might have given way under the shot blasting or sandblasting. So that's the first thing you fail on. You should have done both. Secondly, you should have set up a better system that was foolproof. It's taken them to different sandblasters, and then you'd have been all right, or put some kind of stickers. I know it wasn't your fault, but it wasn't enough to do. And secondly, the inconclusive bit from the pies?
Yeah.
The research. Well, if no pie came out tops, it actually doesn't matter because no pie won. It was inconclusive.
We're
they
all
didn't
the
come
same.
out with. They were very similar.
In the brotherhood and sisterhood of pies, they're all equal.
Overall, that pies, that it was inconclusive. That people liked the pies.
It's all cat food anyway.
Anyway, not forgiven.
The Confessions Podcast.
2. The all-forgiving Father Mayo and the Collective. My tale is set in the winter of 1983 in an East Anglian town. I had been made redundant by a clothing company over the summer and had spent the months since then fruitlessly applying for other jobs. Being a coastal town, the economy there was very much geared towards the tourist trade, and once the summer season had finished, there was little work to be had. In the dreary days before Christmas, I found myself sitting in a cafe, licking my wounds after yet another unsuccessful job interview. I was staring into my almost empty coffee cup when I heard 2 female voices over my left shoulder. They were the only other customers, so it wasn't difficult to tune into their conversation. Voice number 1 is very helpful kind of stage guidance here. Voice number 1 was rather snide and superior and was doing most of the talking. The second voice had a more reasonable tone. I could do that. And this seemed to have little effect on the near monologue that I began paying attention to. Voice number 1. I'm returning it to the shop. I know it's a bit like the vicar voice, but it's just snide and superior, okay? I'm returning it to the shop tomorrow. They do not have a leg to stand on. I have my receipt, and I will say that the coat is substandard. I have deliberately broken the thread on the hem and the side seams so it looks as if the coat is coming apart. Is all from voice number 1. Do you remember that shop on the corner of the High Street? The one that closed in the summer? So voice number 2 comes in. Remember the reasonable voice. Yeah, I do. I understand that all the staff lost their jobs. It was quite sad. Well, says voice number 1. I often returned clothes to that shop. I would wear them to a disco on Friday or Saturday and then return them the following week for a refund. I'd keep my receipts and say the goods were not suitable or just faulty. They just had to give me a full refund. Wow, says voice number 2. Now I know how you always look so well dressed. Didn't the shop manager question you about returning clothes you'd worn? Ha ha, says one. I dealt with her. One time she refused to give me a refund as she said the cream-coloured coat I was returning was dirty and had obviously been worn numerous times. So I wrote to the head office and she was given an official reprimand. I used to threaten to write to their head office every time they questioned me and they always caved in. So she's crowing right all the way through this.
That voice, I wouldn't have thought that person went to a disco, would you?
No.
How very
There you go.
How very surprising.
Anyway, she says, remember, the customer is always right. I hope she lost her job when the store closed, said voice number 1.
Oh.
There was a brief silence. I imagined her friend weighing up a response to this and then thinking what was the point. A scraping chair broke the tension, and then voice number 1, I need to go to the toilet before I catch the bus. I'm going to return a dress I bought last week. I wore it to a party last Saturday, but I'm going to return it to the store for a refund. Say it's all messy. And with that, the two of them made their way to the ladies, and I was left alone with the growing realization that the reprimanded manager featured in her story was me. Wow. A year before being made redundant, I had been given an official reprimand by my area manager for refusing to give a refund to a customer. I finally turned around to see where they were sitting and saw that voice number 1's coat was right behind me. Before I realised what I was doing, I picked up the soft plastic bottle of bright red tomato ketchup from my table, lifted the hood of her cream-coloured coat and drew a large curve of ketchup across its back. I think I emptied the entire bottle. As I let go of the hood, I heard a plop sound as it hit the ketchup. I then gathered up all my stuff, swiftly exited the cafe, and waited in the bus shelter over the road. A winter squall had kicked up. When voice number 1 lifted her hood to keep out the wind and rain, my artwork revealed itself. As the rain hit the back of her coat, the watered-down red ketchup started trickling down the back. It looked like a huge red smile dripping with blood from a horror movie poster. As my bus approached, I muttered to myself, try taking that coat back for a refund. So, this is my moment to the all-forgiving collective, asking for your forgiveness. I can tell you, Wendy, everyone's going to be fine with this. I just think there are some times where revenge is forgiven. I certainly do not ask forgiveness from voice number 1 for damaging her coat. She deserved it. I do ask forgiveness from the owner of the cafe, as I'm sure voice number 1 would have returned to the cafe and somehow blamed him for the ketchup stain, because we'd worked out the kind of woman she was. I also ask forgiveness from any passers-by who may have been alarmed at the state of a large red blood-stained smile on the back of a coat on this East Anglian coastal town. Finally, I ask forgiveness from my husband of 35 years for keeping the secret of the official reprimand from him until now, as I was so embarrassed.
Oh, a sympathy vote at the end. Did you like that? That was good.
Just going in.
Throw that in there.
If you weren't going to forgive Wendy, and then finally, with her final sentence, little flourish, and she's in there with an embarrassment line. So it's just one of those moments where she was in the right place at the right time. She heard the woman confess, and it was kind of her who got her the reprimand, and then the bottle of tomato sauce was just where she needed it to be. Yes, Joe.
Who would have thought that Hyacinth Bouquet would be a disco diva? Because that was very much who you were channeling there, I think, or something like that. No, I mean, this is a wrong thing to do. I know people do this. They do wear stuff and they do send it back, and I just feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. So it's not something I would do, and it was a very wrong thing to do. And then the gloating as well. Just how obscene was that? That was just awful. So no, absolutely forgiven.
So you are going to forgive Wendy?
Oh yeah, sorry,
yes,
I'm forgiving Wendy. I'm not forgiving the gloating disco.
Oh
woman.
No.
But yeah, totally forgiving Wendy.
Disco voice number 1. Yes, Bobby.
What are the chances? You're sitting in a cafe and you get this chance to kind of pay back for against someone that's totally wrong, a serial returner. Small stores have a tough time enough with coping with things like this. So it's definitely behind you, and it just proves that revenge is a dish best served with sauce, really, isn't it? Really, I think. And you are forgiven. It was glorious.
It's the kind of thing that you just dream of actually happening. When something like we've been talking about being outraged, and you just think, if only I'd been there, or if only I'd had the ketchup, if only I could have done. Oh, I am Fantastic.
It's like a James Stewart film, isn't it? You can just imagine It's a Wonderful Life, something like that.
The Confessions Podcast.
A confession from Wendy there, which we call Dirty Dripping Hood. Most of you on the People's Verdict were very much on Wendy's side, although there was one verdict which had the respondent seeing red. Tom imbued, definitely forgiven, goes to show that your past will always catch up with you.
Hey.
You're good on a cymbal, you know.
Comedy drums. Still to come on this week's podcast, find out which confession put Joe and Bobby slap bang in the middle of a horror movie.
Oh, the horror. The horror.
Yes.
Oh, the horror. The penny drops at exactly the same point. I'm sure it did for everybody listening right now, but Bobby and I just looked at each other in absolute abject horror. That's awful. How mortified would you be?
Regular listeners will know that probably involves clothes.
Expensive ones.
OK, so now's the time where we head over to the parish notice board. Not decorated yet, but just a matter of time given the amount of tinsel that we have. But what have you got there, Joe?
Let me see. Oh, I've got this missive from Cindy Thompson in Kansas, no less.
All right, Cindy.
Dear Simon and Joe and the Giving of Merch Collective. She wants something, obviously. A few months back, you offered to send car stickers if we signed up new listeners to your podcast. Is that what you Brits call them? Something like that? We call them bumper stickers here in the US, but I think it's car stickers to you. Since I love your show, I signed my husband up and sent in the proof. He now listens every week and has a confession of his own that I hope he sends in soon. Better be quick. Weeks went by and I sort of forgot about the whole thing. One day, a large white envelope arrived in the mail. PTO for photo. I'm just having a look here.
It's from Budapest.
If you can read the printing, you'll see why it freaked me out. First, my address is slightly wrong. I live in Salina, not Celine, or Saline, and my zip code has 5 digits, not 3. One sticker seems to say it came from Hungary, and another says from the Netherlands. What could this be? I was apprehensive when I opened it. Inside was a long piece of paper, white on one side, silvery on the other. No printing on it, no message with it. I showed it around the family. We were all flummoxed. Gently pushing it back into the envelope in case it exploded, I set it aside and mostly forgot about it. I came across it again while doing some pre-holiday cleaning, and this time, since it hadn't exploded yet, I was braver and I proceeded to examine it more carefully. I saw that it was actually 2 layers of paper, and when I pulled them apart, I was stunned. My bumper sticker! Oh. That's where we were heading. How foolish I felt. Thank you for sending it. It now has pride of place in my car's back window. Your friend in Kansas, Cindy Thompson. Wow.
What's it? Has it gone via Budapest?
And the Netherlands.
How freaky.
Because we're looking at the photograph that Cindy sent. It's right. It's got Magyar Post, Budapest, and then a sticker below it from the Netherlands.
And also it says, if undelivered, please return to Budapest, not to Radio 2.
Someone's trying to take Radio 2 car stickers.
It sent economy, though, wasn't it? So, yeah.
Well, classic BBC. Anyway, Cindy, thank you very much indeed. Bobby, what have you got?
Jack Wilfan has been in touch. He says, Dear Simon, Joe and Bobby, I want to thank you for your amazing podcast and show.
It is amazing, isn't it?
It is. I am someone who has followed the show and the confessions for many years, and I am a big fan. I have managed to get the family and my friends to sign up to the podcast and would love to have some Radio 2 tat before the show comes to an end. Kind regards, Jack Wilfan.
Jack, well, you're lucky.
Hang on, that T-shirt looks familiar.
Yeah, it's the BBC Music Awards
that we give away every week.
Yeah.
That's good tat.
It is, because the Music Awards don't exist anymore. Do they exist anymore? I don't know. Who knows? Anyway, the T-shirt is there, and something that does exist and has a budget, because it's got a bag on it, is a BBC Sounds mug.
Whoa.
How about that?
Is that the £1.50 mug that Joe and I said we would pay £1.50 for that mug?
Maybe we should stuff some fat tinsel in the envelope as well.
It's one of those designs that almost certainly cost an absolute fortune, but your kids could have done it.
Yeah, you'd never know.
In an art class. Anyway, in a true sort of W1A style. Anyway, Jack, we'll send it to you. Thank you very much indeed. If we don't break it before it gets there. I've got this from Andy Mullen. Hi, gang. I've listened to every single one of the Confessions podcasts. I download and listen to them back to back when travelling to and from Walton-on-the-Naze in Essex to Burnley in Lancashire. It's a trip I do 3 or 4 times a year to visit my parents. I'm sending you all the code phrases that I managed to remember and some that I just guessed. I collected them whilst driving at night, so please forgive any mistakes. So, in no particular order. Have a Turkish cigarette, stationery cupboard, successfully negotiated my first tongue, suffering from prickly chest syndrome, someone must have spiked my drink boss, why the big gap, Big Sean, I don't remember that one, darker than a goth's wardrobe, I have a woman's head in my bag.
Oh, I remember that one.
What's Game of Thrones got to do with anything, Nigel? A nipple to knee, please, Barber. Pleasantly damp undergarments.
Always wrong.
Mr. and Mrs. Pineapple. Alan, Al. Keep it groovy. You made my wife smell of fish. Billy Bragg tattooed my goat. That's the name of a novel, isn't it, really? Anyway, Andy Mullen, Walton on the Naze, thank you very much indeed.
What madness has been going on here all these years? What madness. If you do want to get in touch with the podcast, there's not a lot of time left, so you better get your skates on. 2 weeks and then the curtains on the booth are drawn for the final time. It's confessions@bbc.co.uk.
Now it's time for the grubby part of the notice board. It's time to see what non-compliant confessions we received this week. Keith in the Northwest deserves a triple X for his story, which involved fooling his 14-year-old son into believing that he'd been contacted directly by the head of a telecommunications company for spending too long on websites enjoyed by, but not aimed at, teenage boys.
Ooh, that's mean.
We have Jane's dirty confession, which involves a teenage son. But the incident in question occurred when he was just 2 years old. It involved a number 2, a doormat, and a very mean cafe owner. Needless to say, not many customers ordered the chocolate mousse that evening.
Okay, now I can understand why these are non-compliant. Seafaring Sophie's sordid story saw her enjoying some extracurricular activities until her paramour's girlfriend came to call, and in classic Whitehall Farce style, she had to hide under the bed, her presence almost being given away by a fizzing can of cider. It's a sitcom.
Treasure tells a tale of how an early morning armed forces drill caused her to stock up on sweets while waiting for the all clear, without realising their laxative qualities. Why am I getting all these ones?
You do get all the lax ones, don't
Good grief. The 4-minute warning came far too late for her and her uniform on that day. Right, move on.
And Ewan from Eastern Scotland had the opposite condition on a Christmas visit to his big brother's shared city centre flat. The resulting Yule log really was a gift that kept on flushing.
Just to be clear, none of these are okay.
Anyway, it's time to move on and back to this week's confessions with Emily's tale, which we called Threads Are Burning.
The Confessions Podcast.
Simon the Collective. I'm writing to ask forgiveness for my rather overzealous bonfire night duties. Many years ago, I was 8 years old. Bonfire night, my favourite night of the year. My dad had spent all afternoon building the fire, whilst my sister and I made a guy out of some old clothes Dad had grabbed from his wardrobe. My mum was baking potatoes and sausages in the kitchen, and things were getting pretty festive by dusk. Mum and Dad's friends arrived with their children, clanking their bottles of wine and talking about hot toddies. You know, that kind of conversation which parents have. The festivities soon began. My dad ceremoniously set fire to the fire. My dad's firework display left us oohing and ahhing. Mum's jacket potatoes and sausages all went down a treat, along with a lot of pop and mulled wine. This all took a few hours, and much merriment was had by all, until the fire died down and the parents all slowly decamped to the kitchen, leaving us kids to it. The fire really looked like it was going to go out, and we were having such a good time, we all took on the challenge of keeping the fire going no matter what. Twigs, sticks, grass, even flowers, but we soon ran out of supplies. I was sent off to the house to look for any old rubbish that would burn. I had a huge stack of comics and decided I would sacrifice a few. They burnt really well, and we whooped around the fire singing until they burnt out. My sister and I kept making trip after trip to get a few more comics to burn, to keep it going until we realised we'd burnt all the comics.
I have such a bad feeling about this.
You are quite correct to have that feeling. So the search was on for something else to keep the fire burning. I ran to my parents' wardrobe and looked through it and saw a velvet jacket. I held it up to my sister and I said, "Mum never wears this." I don't think she even likes it.
Because it's very special.
I don't even think she likes it. She won't mind if we burn it. Will she? My sister hesitated a few seconds and then nodded and ran down the stairs to show our campfire mates that all was not lost. The fire would go on. Well, the jacket didn't take long to burn, and we were soon making multiple trips to my mum's wardrobe for more fuel. The parents were all having a grand time in the kitchen, smiling at us fondly and telling us what a great job we were doing of keeping the fire going. We carried on, buoyed by the excitement of it all and finding lots of clothes that Mum rarely wore.
Oh, my God.
Eventually, we had entirely emptied her wardrobe except for one item. It was a floor-length pink and white polka dot evening gown. I looked at my sister. "That looks like a very special dress. I don't think we should burn that." My sister shook her head in agreement. We had finally to admit defeat and let the fire go out. It was a school night, and we suddenly felt very tired. Everyone left, and finally we went to bed. Next morning, my sister and I were woken by my mum banging around in her wardrobe and shouting at my dad, "I don't understand! Where is everything, Dave?" I hid under the bed covers and did my best impression of a very soundly asleep child as my mum stormed into our room and burnt her with a burnt rag in her hand. She'd obviously been out to check. "What have you done?" I shrunk further down as she asked my sister, "Did you burn all my clothes?" My sister, who was not so good at her very soundly asleep child impression, quavered, "Yes, but only the ones you don't wear. And it wasn't my idea, it was hers." She pointed at me. Mum was having none of it. "You're the older, you should have known better. All I have to work today is this ball gown, and it's pink." I decided to yawn very loudly and wake up at that point. "Oh, that's my favourite dress of yours, Mummy. I think you should wear it to work. It's very nice." Mum glared at me and stormed out of the room, berating my dad for some reason or other. My sister and I skulked around and got ready for school. We never did see what Mum wore to work that day, as Dad had been handed all the childcare duties by this point. We left Mum rummaging in the dirty laundry basket. We never heard another word about it from Mum or Dad, and I always wondered why until I asked her many years later. She said she felt so bad leaving us playing around a fire while they sat in the kitchen making merry with their friends that she was just grateful that nothing more serious had happened. So I asked forgiveness not from my mum, who was left with only a ball gown for workwear, nor from my dad, who was somehow to blame in the end, according to Mum, but I do seek forgiveness from my sister, who took the blame for the events of Bonfire Night and was ignored when she pointed out to my mum that I was the ringleader. The accusation, "You should have known better, you're older," was a recurring theme of many of our childhood escapades that we got caught on, and which I can honestly say were usually led by me. So I'd like to ask forgiveness from everybody. I just got carried away with the festivities. But I have to say, that's pretty extreme. Burning your mum's entire wardrobe apart from a ball dress. Anyway, here we go with sister.
Oh my gosh.
Sister's here. What do you say?
Sister's mercy. Or not. There was that line that you just delivered, and I honestly thought she was going to say, "We never did see Mum again." I thought,
No.
because I would have done. But you know what? Mum would have gone out and got a whole new wardrobe. So always a silver lining on any
Yes.
cloud, you know. So, and how old were they?
8.
She was 8.
And the older one was still older.
Older. So would they know? No, I think it's naivety, and it's, you know, just kind of being a little bit foolish, isn't it? And just being so excited about burning stuff, being fire starters. So forgiven.
Okay.
Why? Why Mum's clothes? Why not Dad's clothes?
I don't know.
Dad.
Maybe
Dave's.
didn't have enough. What do you say, Bobby?
I'm so shocked. I'm so shocked that you do know that was wrong, even if you were given over to the moment.
8 years old.
Yes, you do know not to raid your mum's wardrobe. I'm sure you weren't
And
allowed to go
burn
and
it.
yes, and burning it.
I would never have dared,
But
no.
your mum was right, actually. My thing is, where were your parents? It's your parents' fault. It is a bit their fault. Having said that, the mum was great, and she did get a new wardrobe. So I think actually you might get a full house. You're forgiven.
The Confessions Podcast.
Father Simon, Joe, Bobby. My story goes back to the mid-1990s during a period working for a large telecommunications company as supervisor for a team of technical support engineers. Our office was due to take over the work of another part of the company based around 60 miles away. The management team decided that a group of 4 or 5 of us should spend a week at the other office in order to get a more detailed idea of what their work entailed. In order not to cause alarm or distress to the staff who were likely to be made redundant or relocated, we were sworn to secrecy regarding the takeover and briefed that our purpose was to shadow our opposite numbers in order to share best practice. My buddy was their office supervisor called Brian, and it was my mission to understand and memorise their processes to be incorporated into the new structure. It gets better. Brian, because he's all a bit technical.
Okay.
Brian's knowledge was encyclopedic, but you wouldn't want to spend an evening in the pub with an encyclopedia. Our first 2 days together were what you could call politely constructive, but in truth were astonishingly dull as he guided me through his process and procedures document. Imagine how exciting that must be. This consisted of a combination of handwritten and typed information crammed into an old ring binder file, painstakingly and lovingly compiled over several years by Brian himself. I have to admit, it was an impressive labour of love. The company did mass-produce technical operational manuals, but Brian's masterpiece had been started years before starting documents on PCs was commonplace. It was literally a one-off, one-of-a-kind document. It was extraordinary. After 1.5 days of tedium, I realised I wouldn't be able to last the week and fulfil my brief without succumbing to some kind of industrial espionage. Fortunately, Brian's by-the-book work pattern extended to his tea breaks, so when he popped out for his morning cuppa on day 3, I was able to pounce. Technology would translate Brian's tome for me, I thought. Just 10 minutes of photocopying would leave me able to write up his life's work back at the office in my own time. What could possibly go wrong with such a simple plan? The photocopying room was thankfully located on a different floor to the office and canteen, and furnished with about a dozen quietly humming Xerox and facsimile machines of various shapes and sizes. The one I selected for my subterfuge was one of those new automatic feed machines which allowed you to bulk stack a large wad of paper rather than having to place the paper on the glass one sheet at a time. Selecting a thick wad of double-sided sheets from Brian's painstakingly constructed folder, I put them in the tray and pressed the button. As the machine whirred into life and started to make reassuring duplicating noises, I opened the door slightly and checked both ways down the corridor for sign of anyone I recognised. There was nobody there. As I turned back towards the copier, I froze in horror as my brain tried to comprehend what I was seeing. Instead of pristine duplicates of Brian's toil coming out of the copier, there were hundreds of thin strips of paper. As it dawned on me that this modern flashy machine was not a fancy new copier, it was a paper shredder.
Oh my gosh.
I desperately and hopelessly tried to claw back the sheets of paper before they continued on their relentless transformation into hamster bedding, obviously to no avail. Although it seemed like hours, only about 5 minutes had expired since I had left the desk. I hastily returned to the office, shamefaced, with my clammy hands clutching the now considerably lighter version of Brian's devastated file. Desperately thinking on my feet and in an effort to look nonchalant, I walked to the far end of the office and shoved the folder deep into the far recesses of a bookshelf full of technical manuals. I then grabbed a coffee and returned to the desk and tried to look studiously at my earlier notes. When Brian returned, he immediately asked where his folder was. I burbled something along the lines of, "I don't know, mate. I was wondering that myself. Certainly here when I went for a coffee." He then spent the next 15 minutes looking everywhere around the desk and office for his masterpiece, returning to previously searched places that had already been checked several times before, just in case it had reappeared 3 seconds since he last looked. I think we've all looked for things like that. Of course, it never turned up. This work of art had disappeared forever, and barring some sympathetic platitudes, there was nothing that I could do to help him. Barring confessing my error, which would have effectively blown my cover and put my own job at risk, even though the likelihood was that Brian would never have to use them himself again. All it meant was that I had to transcribe the process from my own notes, rather than copy them straight from his hard-won research. The next 2 days seemed to drag on even longer than the first 3. Brian did his best to take me through the process from memory, but his broken heart wasn't in it. When the week was finally over, I shook an increasingly forlorn-looking Brian's hand and wished him all the best. He had aged 20 years in the week that I'd been there. I obviously never got the chance to ask Brian for forgiveness, so through your kind hearts and wise counsel, I seek it now and hope it's not too late. For my penance, I ended up writing the whole process from scratch anyway. Eternally ashamed. That's from Raphael. He actually signed it Shredder, but we thought we'd change that because that would have given it away. And it's also a Ninja Turtles reference for the hardcore. What do you say, young Joe, to Raphael?
Oh, the horror. The horror.
Yes.
Oh, the horror. The penny drops at exactly the same point. I'm sure it did for everybody listening right now, but Bobby and I just looked at each other in absolute abject horror. That's awful. How mortified would you be? Obviously, it's a shortcut that Raphael should never have taken, but I think he paid for it in the long run. The guilt and the having to look at Brian and then having to copy it all out. So I'm going to forgive, just
Really?
because, it was a stupid thing to do, and he was caught out.
Now, Bobby is looking distinctly
Oh, you're not
unimpressed.
forgiving?
I don't think she
Really?
is. No.
Well, I understand that you didn't intend to shred it. The thing is, you did intend to steal it. And it was Brian's life work. Not only that, but you mocked Brian's life work, but you still wanted to take it. So you didn't want to spend an evening in the pub for him. You didn't ask him for his information. You took it and you ruined it because you were lazy, you were a cheat, and, used
Lazy,
as a...
cheat, good for nothing,
and
Raphael.
used as a spy by your company, because I don't know what happened to Brian. Did Brian keep his job?
Well,
did they keep the brains behind it?
I'm guessing probably not.
Susie, that's what makes me sad. And Brian doesn't have his file anymore. So Raphael, not forgiven.
See, Joe, you're a pushover.
I know, I really know I am. Completely.
You were quite hardcore to
I'm so
start
gullible.
with. Now you forgive anyone.
The Confessions Podcast.
A confession there from Raphael, which we called Binders Weepers. And if you missed the confession going out live, you wouldn't have heard the reaction on the people's verdict. Would you like to hear it now? Well, you're just about to. And the final one from an anonymous person who simply says, Raphael, 20 years, hard labour, terrible, low-level hound.
Some people take it quite personally.
They really do, don't they?
That's it from this batch of confessions. Send it... No, don't bother. But the podcast fun is not over yet. Oh, no, because here comes a confession from the crypt, and it's a big one, this one.
This one's been requested by Emmeline, who says, Dear Father, Simon, Joe and Bobby, I'd like to request a confession from the crypt that still brings a smile to my face every time I think about it. It involved a drunken Geordie, the beautiful South, and an Arsenal footballer. I think it played sometime over the last couple of years. Many thanks from a long-time listener, but first-time emailer, and that is Emmy.
OK, here it comes.
The Confessions Podcast.
Dear Monsieur Mayo and Collective, I wanted to relate a story to you that happened about 20 years ago. It involves my beloved Newcastle United, slight inebriation, and a popular pop combo famed for their hits A Little Time, Perfect 10, and Rotterdam.
Okay.
On the 10th of January 1996, I made the long midweek trip from Newcastle down to London to watch the quarter-final of the League Cup. This was Arsenal against Newcastle. Newcastle were a different proposition in the mid-90s and managed to almost win lots of things. So anyway, it didn't go to plan and Arsenal beat us 2-0. It wasn't the result that annoyed our travelling hordes, but the blatant and consistent fouling of our French flair winger, David Ginola, by England international and Arsenal fullback Lee Dixon. The poor put-upon French genius was clearly at the end of his tether. When he finally snapped, he brought down Dixon in the second half. Unbelievably, the ref didn't take into account the battering he'd received and sent him off. I was incensed. The Newcastle fans were incensed. It was a long journey home, stewing over the obvious and predictable display of petulant, prancing footballers, epitomised, in my opinion, by Arsenal and their England international and fullback, Lee Dixon. Anyway, fast forward a few months later, I find myself on the train again down to the Big Smoke as my sister had blagged some free tickets to see the beautiful South at the Royal Albert Hall. How about that? Very nice too. Imagine my excitement. Backstage passes to one of my favourite bands. As we arrived, we were directed into a very swanky VIP sidebar to have a free glass of something, and lo and behold, there across the room, unbelievably you might think, was England international and Arsenal fullback Lee Dixon.
Oh, yes.
This is not going to end well. I felt the frustration of my previous night in London niggling away somewhere in the back of my mind, but I managed to suppress it. We went back to the bar, where we got talking to a kind old man who turned out to be as excited as us. He was the drummer's dad, and he'd got a box for him and his family. He invited us, though I have to say to the dismay of his wife, to come and sit with them, as we were proper fans. What a lovely bloke he was, loving every moment of his son playing an iconic venue and ordering champagne like it was Panda Pop. After the gig, we were ushered through the rabbit warrens of the Albert Hall to the backstage party. Again, free drinks were laid on, and given the excitement, I might have had one or two. Sister and I were standing rather too close to the band, considering my tired and emotional state, but I guess I wasn't causing any problems, though I do remember Paul Heaton leaning over and saying, and I quote, "No matter where you go around this planet, you'll always find a Geordie who's more drunk than you are." Anyway, but then who should wander up to us but England international and Arsenal fullback Lee Dixon, with a big black felt tip pen and a lovely glossy programme, grinning at the band and interrupting them so that they would sign his memorabilia. I recall that the whole band nonchalantly signed his book while still chatting amongst themselves and generally paying him not a lot of attention. When it was handed back to him, book and pen together, he looked at me and, understandably not recognising me from the Highbury crowd from some months before, handed it over thinking I was part of the beautiful South. It was at this point that my football-fuelled foolishness took over and I couldn't help myself. Lee, isn't it? I said, all musician-like, and he nodded excitedly, thinking that one of the band had finally noticed who he actually was. I wrote a few words and signed his programme, looking up halfway through and giving him a knowing yet friendly wink. Handing it back to him, I was rather hoping that he'd wander off without looking at what I'd written, but he stared straight at the scribbles and read the big letters out loud. Now, unfortunately, I can't actually say precise, but this is our version. To Lee, you're a cheating, fouling, and then I can't quite see this word. And then I signed it, lots of love, David Ginola. Lee was understandably annoyed and walked away in what can only be described as a bit of a strop. So, Father Simon, I don't seek forgiveness from the following people. Not my sister, who not only got me the tickets in the first place, but kindly put me up in her house in Kennington that evening. I don't seek forgiveness from any of the beautiful South, as I enjoyed what I remember of that gig. However, I do seek forgiveness from the scores of people I've told an incorrect story to over the years. It's only recently, 20 years later, I found highlights of the game online. It would seem that it was Nigel Winterburn who so robustly tackled David Ginola and not Lee Dixon. Oh well. The devil is in the detail, and I would like absolution for my thus far inaccurate tale. Well, I remember you had Lee Dixon on at 10 to 7.
Yes.
Because he was a Five Live summariser. And I confessed that I had joined in the chanting
about Lee. It's not a very pleasant chant about Lee Dixon.
If Lee Dixon plays for England, so do I. That's how the song went. And he forgave me because he thought he couldn't believe it either.
No.
Lots of the time. Anyway, Tony would like the forgiveness, first of all, from Sister Bobby.
Tony, you see, this is what happens when you have too much pop.
An awful lot of pop, I think. To be honest, we took out some of it.
Okay, too much pop. And I just don't think it was very fair on the beautiful South. I think Lee would probably, think, okay, I can withstand that. But actually, the real victims here are the beautiful South, who basically, Lee thought you were one of the band members. So one of those band members he would think was being misquoted or being rude. So I think on that count, because you pretended to be somebody else, that's why I can't forgive you.
Oh, right. So it's for the sin of pretending to be in the beautiful South?
Yeah, because it's not from the beautiful South. They wouldn't write that.
I think they can probably get over that. It'll be something to do with those millions of album sales, I would imagine. Yeah. Brother Matthew, what are you saying?
Yes, I wonder how this confession got through, where Arsenal have described a bunch of petulant fancy Dans. Amazing how that managed to get through the filters. Yeah, isn't it a defender's job to do the tackling? That's what I mean, my knowledge is obviously pretty limited, but I'm going to say that a defender's job in football is to do a bit of tackling.
So Nigel Winterburn and Lee Dixon were actually just doing what they were supposed to do.
Job. However, how big a fan are you if you're asking for the band signatures and you give it to someone who you clearly don't recognise? It turns out Lee Dixon, not quite such a big Beautiful South fan. So I am going to forgive, because Lee had it coming with asking random members of the public if they were in Beautiful South, and they weren't.
I do like the phrase petulant prancing footballers.
Yes, you do. When it applies to a certain North London club.
The Confessions Podcast.
That was your confession from the crypt this week, Tony's tale, which we called Morning Mr. Magpie. And I do think that's a particularly memorable confession. And I love it for the fact that Paul Heaton appears. And you can just hear Paul Heaton saying that line, which was, wherever you go in the world, there's always a Geordie who's drunker than you are. If you made it to the end of the last podcast, we asked you to tweet me the phrase, what a wally. Thanks, Ed, Lynn, Michelle, and in all the others who tweeted that. This week's code phrase is decided by Joe Wiley.
Okay, I think it will be, I don't know, man in a vest.
Yes.
Okay, man in a vest is what you have to tweet. Thank you very much. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, I can't really see what the point is, really. You can just get the next one. Anyway, there's much fun to be had at the BBC Sounds app. Let's just encourage people to wallow around there, assuming you've got some data on your phone, unlike me and Joe.
Me, yes.
So thank you very much indeed for downloading. We'll try it all again next week.
The Confessions Podcast. Go in peace.
Hello, it's Ken Bruce from The Ken Bruce Show on BBC Radio 2, the home of Popmaster. Do you love a quiz? Do you know your music? Do you know your Dolly Parton from your Dua Lipa? Your Status Quo from your Simple Minds? Your Ed Sheeran from your Electric Light Orchestra? Well, if you do, I think you're going to love the Popmaster podcast, which is available now. It's your chance to hear our daily music quiz from our weekday morning show, where we test your pop knowledge over the last 50 years. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to the Popmaster podcast on the BBC Sounds app. You know you want to.
Listen to more podcasts from Radio 2 by downloading the BBC Sounds app.